folks, and welcome to Brad Dacus Live here on his channel. We're so glad you joined us. I'm Michael Peffer, Senior Attorney at Pacific Justice Institute, and I'm the Director of the Santa Ana office here in Southern California. Mr. Dacus is unable to be with us today, but we have a special show for you. And that show in the second hour will include an attorney whose firm specializes in gun rights. And there's a awful lot going on right now in our country about gun rights. Sure, a lot of people think, oh, there's too many guns and everything like that. And look, reasonable people can have that discussion. But there is no discussion, there is no controversy that the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution not only states that we have the right to possess firearms, but holds that it is a right that's given by God, that we already have. Remember, when we talk about rights, when we talk about the issues of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and so on and so forth, when we talk about those rights, we have to remember this, that the Bill of Rights, that where we find the First Amendment and Second Amendment, was not created in order to give us those rights, only to make sure that it was understood that we as Americans have these rights. And this whole issue, not just the gun rights, but our First Amendment concerns, our freedom of association concerns, and right to practice our faith in the way that our faith dictates it. All these things are issues that we have to look at in our society right now. And we have to remember these are God-given freedoms, right? These are not freedoms that the government gives us. The government doesn't get to say, oh, well, you can have a little bit of rights and freedom here, but we're going to take it out over there. We have rights that are guaranteed by God. And I think that has been for many centuries, or for two and a half centuries nearly, what makes America different is that its people are presumed to have been given rights by God. And those rights, we cannot simply turn them over to the government, because it's not the government to give or take away our freedoms. It is our God-given right to have these freedoms. So that for the second half, we'll speak with an attorney who addresses these Second Amendment and gun rights issues. There's some things going on right now, and we think you're going to be pleased with that. In our first half here, we have been discussing, and it has been this whole idea of when are the schools going to happen? When do some of these COVID restrictions find limitations? And what can we do? So there's a lot happening here, and we're starting to see some schools open, but I think for many people, not quick enough for them. And to talk about this, one of our star attorneys from our Nevada office, Emily Mimnaugh, is joining us today. Thanks for coming on, Emily. Appreciate it.
Hey, Michael. Thanks. Really great to be. Question about school reopenings has been an ongoing one really since they first shut about a year ago now. A groundbreaking study came out that's been acknowledged by multiple authorities in the United States. Dr. Fauci, the head of the CDC, made the front page of the New York Times. And in a nutshell, this study, which was published in the Journal of Infectious Diseases, which is published by the Oxford University Press, this study came out and said that in a school context, looking at both students, children from grades 2 to 12, as well as staff, so adults, looking at both of those groups, they found no meaningful difference in the rate of COVID cases, regardless of whether they observed a minimum of 6 feet social distancing or 3 feet. And that's really significant because in the United States, of course, we've been following a general rule of thumb, 6 feet. You go to any grocery store, any retail shop, anywhere, it's literally printed on the floor pretty much everywhere you look. But internationally, actually, the standard has generally been 3 feet, and that is the recommendation from the WHO. And so this is the first study we really had to assess, well, is there a meaningful difference? And so they looked at this, like I said, in a school context, but obviously it has great implications potentially beyond that. But obviously in the first instance, we're going to look at this in relation to school reopenings and what that can mean for schools, especially those who want to get students back to in-person learning, but may be struggling because of facility limitations.
Yes, yes. And you know, what's interesting about these times that we've lived here in Emily, is that it's like it started out that nobody really knew anything, but they said they knew something. And so we kept following, and then of course research would find out that we're going to go this direction or that direction. And so this has continued where you got to wonder half the time who's making these calls, and now we have this issue of needing to get our kids back in school, and so finally it seems like the research is catching up.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, everybody wants to be safe, and in the first, looking back, we're at the 1-year anniversary now, and everyone, I think, is thinking, what was I doing a year ago when this was first happening? And of course, we were getting different reports. Some people, Dr. Fauci said, don't wear a mask, then it was wear a mask, then it was wear 3 masks. And so, the most important thing is to actually follow the science, but actually genuinely follow the science. And that includes admitting when we learn more, when prior recommendations may not have been fully accurate, and adjusting course to reflect that. And this study is extremely robust. It was conducted statewide in Massachusetts. It was conducted over the course of 16 weeks, so about 4 months. It involved over 99,000 adult staff members and over 500,000, over 500,000 students. So it's extremely comprehensive. And like I said, it was looking at, is there any meaningful difference between 3 feet and 6 feet in the school context? And the conclusion was no, you can reduce physical distancing below that 6-foot threshold without any significant negative consequences to health outcomes. So for schools looking to reopen, this is really, really helpful information. And like you said, we're continuing to learn more. And this is definitely something that the CDC has said they are currently reviewing the data because they're extremely interested in it, because it's obviously very relevant.
Yes, and that's such a good point. We have heard over and over again that one of the big problems with putting kids back in the schools, one of the big problems is that it's hard to get them to socially distance. So the more distance you have between them, it seems like the more difficult it is. And it's like, as they say, herding cats, that it's tough to do. So the idea that we could have less distance and still have a safe result, which was what everybody wants, is our children to be safe in school, is a good idea and a step. We're heading in a step in that direction. What do you think the impact of this will be?
Well, in the immediate, you have schools that genuinely want to open. Students want to get back. They want to see their friends. They want to be learning in person like they have for their entire lives. Faculty want to go back, at least a lot of them do. And of course, parents want their children to be back in school. So it's important for students, for families, for faculty to all get back to an actual normalcy. And one of the real obstacles we saw time and again was not, necessarily obstruction from the unions or parents not wanting their students to go back, but some schools at least were having physical logistical problems where you simply can't socially distance students within the classroom at the normal capacity and have them 6 feet apart. So if you only need to have students at least 3 feet apart for desks, it's just a very practical logistical situation. You actually can get students back safely into classrooms. And the most important thing I should underline, and highlight is that this was almost ubiquitously in the study with students wearing masks, students and staff. So this is in the context of wearing a mask. So that's where you can have that 3 foot, it looks like. And Dr. Fauci actually said on TV, so publicly, he stated that the study does seem to support the idea that 3 feet is adequate to curb the transmission of COVID.
And that's interesting. So you bring up a point that I think has to be emphasized, that this is assuming that they're wearing masks. This new 3 feet is assuming that it's not necessarily the same result, obviously, if there's no masks.
That's right. We had 242 school districts participate in the study, the statewide study. That's almost every single school district. I believe they have 253. So almost every school district required universal masking. That means both students and staff. And this, of course, was only looking at students from second grade up. So we're not talking about, masking necessarily, putting masks on kindergartners, but for students second grade and up, and of course the adults, they were wearing masks, and they were looking at what's the difference between 3 feet versus 6. Conclusion, there didn't seem to be any real difference in case transmission. So that's incredibly important going forward.
Yeah, and I think this is it's so necessary that kids get back into school. This is children need this. They need to be learning in the learning environment. It's much tougher to do if you are spending your time in front of a computer, as we have seen. So are we how is it going? Overall, are we seeing a movement towards reopening in the schools?
We really are. And, that's even coming from the White House at this point. It's something, of course, we've been talking about for months and months. And many schools, private parochial schools, we know have been open successfully without incident for months and months. But on the public school front, where the majority of America's students do learn, they have been shut, and they've been shut in significant ways with distance learning only, which of course poses significant difficulties, especially for lower income students who have limited access to, or may have limited access to, online materials and to the actual laptops.
Yeah.
And we talked about this previously in Chicago, what a devastating result, where you had, I think it was about 20% of students had never even logged in. Let alone trying to learn remotely. They had never been able to actually access the material to begin with. So the continuation of supposedly distance learning is clearly not been effective. And we've also talked about the significant impacts that's had on mental health. So all of these reasons have been pushing for students to get back in the classroom where parents are supportive, and they really are in many instances.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we've talked about here at PJI for all year, basically, is that we can't continue in this way. And you raised this statistics that talks about how few of the kids are actually doing the distance learning. So when they're saying that we could lose a generation of kids losing a year's worth of education, that's not an overstatement.
No, it's not. And, last Thursday, Mr. Biden gave his first televised address, and he emphasized that, how difficult it's been. I think his phrasing was that we've had an entire generation lose a year of education. Yeah. And I don't know if that's fully true, but it's certainly not far off.
Yeah. So what are some of the recent guidelines? I believe that the CDC has brought about 5 mitigation measures. Can we talk about that?
Right. Yes. Mid-February, the CDC issued revised guidelines to help schools reopen, but of course to mitigate for COVID. And that included wearing masks, which we know, social distancing, of course, cleaning, and that includes ventilation. So focused on, we know it's an primarily airborne disease, making sure that you engage in contact tracing. So if someone becomes ill, you want to, of course, contact trace, quarantine, and make sure that is done. And of course, hand washing, really 5 basic things we really come to know and expect. And really, we've incorporated, many of us at least, have incorporated that into our daily lives and our daily routines, because of course we don't want to get sick and we don't want anyone else to get ill.
Yeah, and sometimes I think about how we as humans learn, and I wonder because people used to always make fun of me because I'm kind of a fastidious individual about washing my hands all the time, and people used to make fun of me with it. But I think that we can actually, and the studies show, we can stop a lot of disease transmission simply by taking that maneuver. Not just COVID. This has to do with all the bacteria and viruses that are transmitted by contact, and that. So I think it's one of the good things out of this is we can make this more of a habit in our society.
No, I think that's absolutely right. We all were told pre-COVID, we all knew we were supposed to sing the happy birthday song once or twice, depending on your dates. And now I've got my iWatch, which my Apple Watch will tell me. It can tell when I start washing my hands, and it will actually buzz me. And lots of places now have little stickers up. I was just at a place the other day where it tells you to sing XYZ song. And, there's lots of reminders now built in, I think, to help us with the routine going forward. Like you say, not just for COVID. Yeah. These are general good guidelines. And so because of that, it's largely been district-based and not statewide mandates we're seeing on reopening. Now, we do have some states, and we can go through those, that do have mandates one way or the other regarding school reopenings. But by and large, across the country, 41 states have left it really up to the counties or the school districts regarding their determination as and how they're going to open.
Yeah, so parents concerned about this, it might not be a bad idea for them to talk to their school boards and encourage them that especially if they have been authorized to open up, encourage them to open up. Well, the problem is, and we're going to show a brief clip here, Emily. The problem is that sometimes it's not well received by the district, by the superintendent and the board of supervisors for education, the school board of education. So let's take a look at this clip out of San Diego County and kind of show maybe why some parents are on edge about this.
A group of frustrated parents gathering outside the La Mesa Spring Valley School District offices Thursday, supporting a recall effort of Board Vice President Charday Belfontenot, who made racial comments during a board meeting on Zoom last week. The fireworks started when board members discussed voting on a date to return to class. Belfontenot's video was off, but her voice was clear as she opposed a vote.
We don't have to give anybody any date. We don't have to do anything that we don't want to do right now. I don't want to be a part of forcing anybody to do anything they don't want to do. That's what slavery is. So how are we forcing people? That seems like a very white supremacist ideology, to force people to comply with, and conform. Just letting you know. Privilege. Check it, you guys.
I can't believe race came into it.
Parent Nicole Malati says she watched the video several times, trying to make sense of it.
I was like, this is not a district that represents me or my kids. So I had issue right off the bat.
Black people want their schools open too. That's not a white thing. Education is the way out of poverty.
Carl DeMaio, the chairman of Reform California, is organizing the recall campaign.
Frankly, it's a smear to suggest that anyone who wants to reopen schools somehow is a white supremacist. That's just, where do you even begin to deal with that sort of irresponsible, inflammatory, false, nasty comment?
There are now 2 petitions online, one in support of the recall, another in support of Belfontenot. Through her attorney, Belfontenot released this statement. The public has the right to pursue a recall just as every student has the right to equal protection from the pandemic when going back to in-person instruction. I am confident that the voters also want every child to be equally protected when returning to school. The district released a statement saying Belfontenot behaved in a manner the board does not condone, nor did her behavior represent our values and our commitments to our students, community, and each other. Meanwhile, the board did vote for the reopening of in-person hybrid instruction on April 19th.
It just so seems like every step along the way, things have become this sort of mixed bag of issues that first of all, many don't even have anything to do with COVID and reopening the schools, but it's become this political football where the Board of Education as well as the unions seem to want to stretch this out. And I think parents are starting to sit up and take notice of this. What have you found relative to, start with national and then we'll come back to San Diego? in far
Sure.
as
So
reopening?
sure. Yeah. Nationally, you've got some states that have 4 states that have ordered schools open, places like Texas, Florida, Iowa, and you have other states, including Washington, D.C., that don't have statewide full closures, but have statewide orders for partial closures. And those are places like New Mexico, Hawaii, California. So you have a few states that have these statewide orders, but by and large, it is, like I said, a district by district, county by county approach. And unfortunately, when you start talking about one thing, school reopenings, what's the safest, best way to get students learning, preferably back in person in the classroom, it ends up being a conversation about 100 other things. And to me, that kind of reminds me of the stimulus bill, which was supposed to be about one thing, and of course ends up, 90% covering a multitude of topics that have nothing to do with the economy, with getting America going again. And I guess the good news is from that stimulus bill, you did get $125 billion earmarked to help K through 12 schools safely reopen. So we know that money has been spent. In Chicago, I think it was over 100 million already has been sent to make sure that buildings and facilities, PPE, everything will be provided for. But of course, you have disparate opportunities. We have students that don't have equal access to learning materials online. You're not getting, in San Diego, we know that students were not getting the same amount of online material. So even if, one student can log in and access their online material, and they may not have literally the same number of hours of educational instruction available to them. So even if you did everything right, you logged in, you got your computer going, you were willing to put in the time on your own at home without teacher supervision, you literally were not being provided the same materials. So that is obviously a serious problem.
Yeah, that is a serious problem. Tell us about the San Diego lawsuit, which has nothing to do with what we started out with in terms of the only locality, San Diego School District. What's happening in this lawsuit that involves in-person school?
And in this case, parents from the North County in San Diego, they filed a lawsuit alleging that the school district and the state, because of the rules of the state, had failed to provide meaningful opportunities for in-person and for online education. And that violates a law that was signed by Governor Newsom just last June 2020, SB 98, which requires school districts to provide in-person instruction and allows that they may also provide distance learning. But the most important part of that is that they shall provide in-person instruction. And so in this lawsuit, which again was a temporary restraining order seeking to stop the state from enforcing these rules that were preventing schools from reopening, the judge came, and this is Cynthia Freeland out of the Superior Court of San Diego. She granted this TRO to stop the state from enforcing these rules. And she said that schools must open as soon as reasonably possible to the greatest extent possible. And then, so that was Monday, March 15. And the state asked for clarification as to what that actually meant. And on March 17, so just yesterday, during oral arguments, the judge clarified she did not mean that this order only applied to the plaintiffs, the parents. It did not apply only to the school district. It did not apply only to the county. She said that this order, preventing the state from blocking schools from opening, applied statewide immediately. So there's going to be another hearing on March 30, but for right now, every single school district is technically subject to this order to open to the greatest extent possible as soon as reasonably practicable.
Yeah, boy, that's interesting, and it's pretty rare to have a Superior Court judge make such a sweeping ruling, but it's welcome, and it kind of points out some of the difficulties with this whole matter. Is that it's like you can't find out who's responsible for all this. So the state says we're going to have you do this, and then the districts say no, we're going to do this, and then you never know who's going to do what. And then it seems like whenever we seem to get a step forward, we take 2 steps backward. And so this TRO, do you know, is it going to be appealed by the state?
We haven't heard yet. The expectation is yes, it will be appealed, though the state asked for something called a stay. They asked the court to basically put a hold on their ruling until they could proceed with an appeal or further proceedings. And the court said, no, we're not putting a pause on this order. The order goes into effect right now, and it applies statewide. And the judge was, to be blunt, very critical of the state. They accused the state of confusion that they perpetuated. That was actually in the order issued on the 15th. They talked about the rules being arbitrary, not really being consistent. Like you were talking about, you've got district rules, you've got these state rules, and then some of the recommendations, some of the guidelines that the state produces, they said some of these are recommendations, some of these are mandatory, but they wouldn't really say which was which. And actually the social distancing came in again, where there had been a suggestion that 4 feet was mandatory, and the court said no, that's again an arbitrary number. And so right now, under the court's order, it's the state's recommended, and I emphasize recommended, 6-foot social distancing where practicable is what's currently legally applicable in the state.
Boy, and one thing that we have seen, Emily, a lot of, and I know you've worked directly on this, one thing that we have seen is that parents are beyond frustrated, and there's so much going on in modern education, in the public school realm, and even some private schools. There's so much going on that's damaging to the children, be it sex education, be it critical race theory, all of these things that are actually tearing down young people. And so many parents have gone a different direction entirely, and maybe when we were talking about before, there's sometimes good things come out of bad things. Maybe that's one of them. We've been a real a cheering section for the concept of homeschool co-ops and homeschooling in general, but tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I think regardless of whether or not you're officially under the title of homeschooling, I think many parents in America would say they feel like they've homeschooled their child for the last year, or their children for the last year. And part of that has meant that where they are doing the online so-called distance learning, they're seeing the material, as you point out, that's being shared and, basically fed to their children as truth, where sometimes these things are really matters of opinion, matters of faith, matters of morals. And you find parents who are continuously surprised and or outraged that things that basically contradict fundamental tenets of their faith are being pushed as truth and science and fact on their students. And so we are seeing this movement to pull children out of public schools and either place them in private schools, parochial schools, or going the homeschool route. And that's where there really is a great resource available to parents and families. If you go to pji.org for Pacific Justice Institute, we can provide more information if you're looking to go that route, because many parents, many families want their students to have an education outside of the public school system and either can't or don't have available to them the private or parochial school options. And they really do want to take control and take the lead on making sure their student is getting a proper and sound education.
Yeah, and that is so important. There's lots of, and these are free resources on our website, and there's a lot there, folks. All you got to do is go on the website and avail yourself of that. Emily, let's talk about some of the issues happening statewide in many, at least 2 states where we've got governors who are having, let's say, difficulties.
They're having extreme difficulties. Of course, Mr. Newsom is facing a almost certain, I would say, recall election at this point. The gathering of signatures ended on March 17, and they needed 1.495 million, which is 12% of those who voted in the 2018 gubernatorial election in California. They received 2.06 million signatures. Currently, they're being validated. That is, officials look at the signatures to determine whether or not it's from an eligible voter. Currently, 84% of signatures have been accepted, so they are well on their way to hit that 1.495, basically 1.5 million signature mark. Yes. And in the clearest sign to date, I think Mr. Newsom knows he's going to be recalled because he actually launched his official campaign to oppose it on Monday.
Yeah. Well, I think that those who are our listeners and support the recall It's not over. There still has to be another election, and we encourage people to stay on this. Emily, I am so thankful that you came on today. It's always a treat. Emily runs our Nevada operation with Pacific Justice Institute. And hey, keep up the good work, and we'll talk to you soon, all right?
Thanks, Michael. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. So yes, it's amazing what God is doing, and as you may know, we now have offices in several jurisdictions throughout the United States. We have offices that are in Florida, New York, Mississippi, Texas, Nevada, Washington, California, Colorado. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but we're very thankful to be able to serve you all basically anywhere you need us. So we have much more, and we'll come back in a moment for that. Thank you.
We direct a statewide order for people to stay at home. That directive goes into force and effect this evening.
Okay, everyone, welcome to this Pacific Justice Institute Zoom call addressing the challenges to religious freedom, and specifically the ability for churches to gather.
Pastor John Duncan says his Sunday sermons won't stop inside his house of worship. Officers entered his church service last Sunday, explaining the orders to close.
Recently, your church decided that you wanted to have a parking lot service, and yet the state of Washington said no.
We were contacted Thursday afternoon by a representative from the governor's office, and they told us it was no longer allowed. So we contacted all of you, and your staff and your lawyers were just so helpful to help us craft a response to that.
For the second day in a row, Oregon Governor Kate Brown faced legal challenges over the state's coronavirus restrictions.
We challenged Governor Brown's orders. We argued that her orders are no longer in effect because she failed to follow a certain part of the Constitution.
My wife and I have been leading Bible studies in our homes for the last few years. And then for the last 2 weeks, the Attorney General and our Governor Inslee argued with 156 pages and 4 separate court documents saying that we did not have the right to pray and have Bible study in my front yard.
Where do we go from here? I get calls at the Pacific Justice Institute all the time from pastors, ministers, and people saying, okay, where are we? Where do we go from here? This can't go on forever, can it? Can the government permanently keep churches from meeting?
I've represented roughly 14 churches, 2 other religious entities, and at least 40 individuals from all across the state in a suit I filed against Governor Brown in Eastern Oregon.
So that judge that you appeared before, that ruling made her executive order null and void and liberated everyone in the state of Oregon. I mean, churches, businesses.
Hello, my name is Pastor Ken Peters, and I am the founder and lead pastor for the church at Planned Parenthood. We are boldly against abortion. We feel like it is the murder of human life. Well, when we got the lawsuit from Planned Parenthood, I'm a pastor. We have never been in a lawsuit before in my 22 years. I made a few phone calls, and over time I ended up with the Pacific Justice Institute. Glory to God. We thank Jesus with all of our heart for the Pacific Justice Institute. God is so good to put them in our state, in our area, and in our path. And we are so thankful that we can covenant together.
A Walnut Church throwing caution to the wind and hosting an outdoor family event today, despite reported threats from LA County officials to shut it down. Lawyers representing On a Mission Church say the church is being discriminated against and targeted by LA County simply because it is a religious institution.
The fact that the county has explicitly and blatantly allowed for other outdoor gatherings with a different perspective, a leftist perspective, a non-Christian perspective, shows the blatant bigotry, and that's why this and actions like this are unconstitutional and will in the end not hold up in a court of law.
Pacific Justice Institute took our case without us having to put up any type of funds, and when Pacific Justice reached out to me and they took our case, it was amazing because, again, it would have been huge. Right now, probably the church would have been out of pocket.
Welcome back to Brad Dacus Live. We're glad you stayed with us and joined us here today. Mr. Dacus is out today, but I'm filling in for him. I'm Michael Peffer, the attorney for the Santa Ana, Southern California area for Pacific Justice Institute. So we have been looking at it and a lot, some of the degrading of our freedoms. And that's always difficult to see that happen. And we don't at all advocate for violence or anything of the sort. But I think that our framers, the framers of the Constitution, did anticipate the fact that someday we might have to fight for our freedoms. But nonetheless, our right to bear arms is much broader than simply that. There's a lot of reasons why, and we're going to talk about a couple really interesting cases from a law firm that knows a thing or two about this. This is part of their specialty area, and we're fortunate to have one of their attorneys, Tiffany Chevron. And she is a former student of mine and now a Power Star attorney. So it's great to have you on, and good day to you.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. You guys have a case, and I think it's called Duncan versus Becerra. Can you tell us a little bit about that case and the facts that led up to where we're at right now?
Sure. So a lot of people know this case if they are a firearm owner in California. It brought about Freedom Week for many people, which basically meant for gun owners in California that they could go and purchase standard capacity magazines holding more than 10 rounds, just like the rest of the country. And so that we've won at the lower levels of the courts, federal courts. We've won at the Ninth Circuit. And the state has appealed this case again to hear en banc with the Ninth Circuit, which means it's going to get reheard, and hopefully we'll win again at the Ninth Circuit. But we're really looking that maybe even this case would be one that would go on to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, interesting. And I've read through the one of the summary judgment ruling that you guys won, and I really appreciate that you guys are there fighting for this, because the case rightly brings up the issue of whether 10 rounds are enough, and who gets to decide that. So for those of our audience that have not really actually heard of this case, tell us what essentially some factual background to it, so that we can understand how big of a deal this is.
Sure. So in California, there was a law passed several years ago in 2016 called Prop 63. And that law, among many things, tried to ban capacity magazines over 10 rounds. And so in the past, we had where you couldn't buy or sell magazines that were more than 10 rounds, but if you still own them, you were allowed to keep them. This new law in 2016 was basically a government taking, because the government said if you have these magazines that you lawfully purchased before this law came into effect, now you have to sell them or get rid of them or get them out of the state. And there was no just compensation from the government, which is one of the elements of a government taking. Mm-hmm. They have to pay just compensation. They just wanted you to get rid of them. Yeah. And so there are several groups that joined together along with several individuals that said, no, this is my right. This is part of being a gun owner, is being able to defend my family and defend myself. And who's to say that 10 rounds is enough? When you have home invasions where 3 or 4 people are coming into homes, who's to say that 10 rounds is enough? Who's to say that 12 rounds is enough? And so in some of the court proceedings, the judge actually asked those questions of the state and said, what is enough? And they got all the way down to one round. Wow. And the state would not concede that even that was too restrictive. So it's a very slippery slope of where do you go and how much power does the government have over you when it's really your life in your hands.
Yeah, and boy, it's actually a great read, if you will, in terms of the state, your case against the state, because it deals with fascinating situations, albeit very tragic situations, where armed people stormed people's homes, and quite frankly, I think for lack of a better way to put it, 10 rounds actually was not enough. The state's restriction did not leave these people well equipped to defend even the most basic deal with owning guns, your own home.
That's right. And, some of our plaintiffs have even said, maybe I have a disability, or I'm a little older and I can't get that magazine changed out quick enough to put another one in. That was one of the state's arguments that, you can have multiple magazines, they just have to be less than 10 rounds. Well, when you're in that kind of situation, you don't know if you're going to be able to change that out or not. And that's putting your life at risk. If you choose to own a firearm for self-defense, you should be able to use it for self-defense.
Indeed. Interesting quote from the case that I read. It says, all Californians, like all citizens of the United States, have a fundamental constitutional right to keep and bear common and dangerous arms. The nation's founders used arms for self-protection, for the common defense, for hunting food, and as a check against tyranny. The court goes on, or the decision goes on and says, today, self-protection is the most important. In the future, the common defense may once again be most important. Constitutional rights stand through time, holding fast through the ebb and flow of current controversy. And so it's almost like some people say, well, why are you guys fighting over the Second Amendment? Because there's always been an attack on the Second Amendment in one way or another, and we have always, and maybe never more than now, needed to be able to provide at least for our own defense.
Yes, the founding fathers made this very clear by making the First Amendment about your freedom of speech, and the second, the ability for you to defend yourself. And it wasn't necessarily just against another individual. It was against tyranny of government, because that's what they had come from. And this whole concept of using something that is a common firearm is a very big deal. That was something that came out of the Heller v. District of Columbia case, where the court said, there are certain firearms that are common in the general public, and using a magazine that's more than 10 rounds is common. There are firearms that are actually sold with magazines that are more than 10 rounds. But in California, you have to get a special magazine for those firearms. So it's just, it's the fact that they're trying to limit your rights yet again in California through this way.
Yeah, boy. And do you guys, your firm at Michelle and Associates, do you do a fair amount of defense of the Second Amendment?
Oh yes, that's one of our main areas of litigation is Second Amendment.
Right, and have you been following, I presume this is kind of a dumb question, following some of the legislation that's current in the House of Representatives right now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I not only our firm, but I work with a lot of different groups in California and across the country, and we are all watching these proceedings with great interest and discussing what's going to be next. And, litigation is already being discussed about a lot of these pieces of legislation that are that are coming up. You know, we have the California Rifle and Pistol Association is the oldest association in California. And then I'm a part of the Second Amendment Law Center, who is also a group of Second Amendment law experts. And we've come together to try to fight back against some of these things that are coming down through Congress. And we just recently this week had a piece of legislation that passed the House that's on the way to the Senate now.
Yeah, it looks like, from what I understand, there's a couple of bills that have, in the very recent past, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. The first one would increase the amount of time that a federal firearms licensee must wait to receive a background check. The waiting period goes from 3 days to 10 days. And then there's another one that would prohibit a firearm transfer between private parties unless there is a licensed gun permit or dealer involved. Is that your understanding as well, Tiffany?
Yes. So what you're seeing is California gun control hitting the rest of the nation.
Wow.
And the people that are not in California, who have not been fighting against these kind of things for decades, are about to get it full force. And the reasoning behind this gun control, what gun control advocates would say, is that it's for safety. It's to eliminate the criminal element that's going on out there. But after decades of watching it happen in California, we know that it does nothing to stop the criminal element. What it does do is it places more restrictions on the average citizen who wants to defend themselves. Yet criminals are not impacted at all because they don't follow the rules anyway. So it doesn't matter how many gun control laws you put into place. The criminals are still going to do what criminals do.
That's right. It's hard to see a criminal who's willing to put a gun to a stranger's head and say, "Give me your money," thinking, "Oh no, is this gun illegal?" It's kind of silly thinking. It's interesting. Is your understanding of this, because as I read it, it seemed very perplexing, this issue of so you can't exchange guns among friends, and lots of people belong to gun clubs. They own guns, and so their friends own guns, and they like to trade between them and deal, and that obviously should be done legally. But a requirement that this has to be some formal transaction where there is, a gun dealer involved, it just seems so much overkill.
Yeah, I'm sure the gang members out on the streets are going to follow this law to the letter.
Yeah.
The problem is that in California, they did put some of these restrictions in place, and it's so difficult for people to even understand what they're doing. They don't even know if they're following the law or not. I talk to people on a daily basis who think that they can just, do certain things with their firearms, and they cannot under the law. You have to say, well, you can't go let your buddy borrow that gun to go hunting anymore unless there's certain restrictions in place, or you can't make this transfer to this person without a federal firearms license person that is doing the transfer. And it's so confusing for the law-abiding citizen who just wants to do it right, and they just want to make sure everything's legal, and they don't even know what the law is because it changes constantly and it's so restrictive.
I know a lot of people because I live in California. It's tough sometimes to find places to shoot guns and whatever, but I know people that they do live in places where they can shoot guns freely. They can carry it. They live in a county that happens to allow for concealed weapon permits freely, and those people, their attitude towards guns is all about safety. The only people that these bills would actually reach in terms of practicality are people that don't care about the law.
That's right. And, most gun owners care about safety.
Yeah.
They train with their firearms. They pass those safety laws and safety advice onto their children and their grandchildren. This is a generational thing for most gun owners.
Yes.
And they want their families to be safe. They want people to understand around them how to use firearms. They want to be able to be a part of a culture, a gun culture that supports the Second Amendment and their freedoms. And this is truly an attack on that. It's not going to affect the crime rate in any way. It hasn't in California. What would affect the crime rate in California is to stop letting criminals out of jail and start prosecuting people for the crimes they actually commit, instead of trying to pass more laws that put these effects on lawful citizens.
Interesting. Republican Congressman Bob Good said, if our Second Amendment right is not safe, no rights are safe. And with this Democrat majority in this Congress, this right is not safe. Now, again, I don't want to be political here. I'm just saying that right now, the power structure in Washington, D.C., like the power structure here in California, leans towards stripping us of our Second Amendment rights. And that simply cannot stand. And we need to be really focused on this and making sure. And frankly, one thing is that this is not just, guys out there in their trucks with their guns. Hey, this is something that is everybody. Gun owners come in all shapes, sizes, and forms. Certainly, both sexes enjoy the freedoms that gun ownership gives. And so this is not just gun nuts out there in their trucks causing havoc.
That's right. And what I find so interesting about the rhetoric from the gun control lobby is that they try to scare people into thinking that these are the crazy gun nuts out there, right? But in California alone last year, we had over 1 million new gun owners that purchased a firearm. Across the country, there were almost 40 million background checks for guns in the past year. This is not something that people are out there screaming for more gun control. Yes. That's the rhetoric. The rhetoric is everyone agrees, right? Everyone agrees we need more gun control. But when you look at the actions of the people of this country, they want to be able to protect themselves and exercise their rights, their fundamental constitutional rights. And those numbers speak volumes to what is actually going on in people's minds. And it's not, we want more control by the government over those rights. That is not what's being said. Right. And a lot of those new gun owners are women. Women make up one of the largest groups of new gun owners in the country. It's growing. We say women's rights are gun rights because women should be able to defend themselves when they need to. They are at a disadvantage many times. And so they need to be able to know how to defend themselves and their families. And so it's a very important issue to a lot of different people.
Yeah, interesting to that. As I was reading through your case there, the Duncan versus Becerra, the case kind of recites a single mom with young children in her house with armed break-in. And so certainly the gun, like our framers intended, is the great equalizer. And that goes with protection as well. But here we have in the federal government, we have in the state governments, and now we've even seen attempts by local cities to have their own gun laws. And are you familiar with the case out of Colorado where they have recently, a judge recently said, no, you can't have, the city can't have stricter gun laws than the state or the feds?
I am. This was a state preemption case in Colorado.
Yeah.
And in Colorado, it's a little different than California. That was a great case, a great win for the Second Amendment advocates in that state. And I'm pleased that they're getting some really good precedent on that. Here in California, and maybe in other parts of the country as well, it's very difficult to prove preemption at the state level. And because of that, we have this patchwork of all kinds of local ordinances that come into play that we have to fight at that level in the courts as well.
Wow.
That say, well, if you come into LA County, you have to treat your firearms in this way. If you go into Orange County, it's different. And these are side by side counties in California for people that don't know that.
Yeah.
And so it's super confusing for gun owners. And the reason for that is that in California, there is this presumption that if the law does not specifically say that the local jurisdiction can't pass something, then they're allowed to.
Wow.
And so it's not a full force law all the time. We do get around it in court quite a bit, but it is a presumption that has to be overcome in the courts.
Yeah, interesting that they mentioned in this case out of Colorado the McDonald versus Chicago lawsuit, and they say that lawsuit, that is the McDonald versus Chicago lawsuit, incorporated the Second Amendment through the 14th Amendment, making it applicable to all states and cities that you have an individual constitutional right to own a firearm. So not to get too in the weeds or technical with this, but the Constitution was obviously originally designed to apply to the federal government and the Bill of Rights as well. And so case by case, time by time, our First Amendment rights, our Second Amendment rights, and so on and so forth have been held by the Constitution through the Supreme Court, saying, no, these apply to the states as well. And the state just cannot be willy-nilly with how they affect that. And that's why it seems like the best way to do this oftentimes is going to be through federal court when you're in California.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're talking Supremacy Clause here, and, the supreme law of the land is basically what you're looking at, and whether the higher authority has supremacy over these lower authorities that are trying to pass laws that violate your constitutional rights. And the Constitution is the law of the land. I mean, that's across the board. And so when we come before a court and we try to attack these laws that are unconstitutional, we have to look at, do they conflict? Do they contradict whatever the higher authority law is? And whether or not the federal government, there's a term, pervades the field, has fully pervaded the field, meaning they've passed laws or they have things in place that would make them the highest authority. And these are all things that have to go into place. The interesting thing is we saw this a couple years ago with the illegal immigrants and states and counties making themselves sanctuary cities for those groups. Yes. And we see it now with states and counties making themselves sanctuary cities for the Second Amendment. Florida has many, many counties in it that are Second Amendment sanctuary counties. Wow. And those counties are saying to whoever comes along to them, the state or the federal government, you know what, we can't go against what law you're putting into place, but we can say that we're not going to spend our resources and we're not going to enforce those laws. That would be commandeering of the state and local resources by the federal government. And so we saw that play out with the illegal alien debates a couple of years ago, where the state of California, for one, made themselves a sanctuary state and said, well, if you want to come enforce those federal immigration laws here in our state, then federal government, you have to pay for it and you have to send your own people in. And so it's going to be a really interesting debate coming along with some of these bills that are coming through the Congress right now. If they get passed, we're going to run into that same kind of debate again. Absolutely.
Well, Tiffany, I suspect we could talk about this for a long time. I sure appreciate you coming on the show. Once again, Tiffany Chevron with the law firm of Michelle and Associates. They do a lot of defense for the Second Amendment, and we're surely glad you're there, and we're glad you were here this morning. Thanks, Tiffany.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. So yes, we are Things are happening almost a mile a minute here. There's a lot happening in our legislatures. We have to be vigilant for our rights. PGI stands for the vigilance that comes with our religious freedoms, with the ability to worship our God in the way that our God dictates our worship, period. And we must continue to fight for those rights, and we need to fight for all of our rights. We need to be vigilant citizens, and that is the price of citizenship, eternal vigilance. Well, once again, we are so thankful that you joined Brad Dacus Live today. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we say to all of you, remember, your rights can be taken away only if you let them. Take care, and God bless.